Okay, welcome to APPA's Facilities Symposium. Today's session entitled Total Cost of Ownership, Module 3. I will be serving as your moderator for today's program. I'm going to turn it over to our speaker in a minute, but before we get started, I want to cover some housekeeping basics. We will be recording this session and posting the recording after the event concludes. All attendees are in listen-only mode. And as such, we will be using the chat feature throughout the program unless your presenter calls for open mic. We do ask that you be mindful to ensure your mic is on mute when you are not speaking in order to minimize interruptions. Please use the chat box function to enter any questions you may have. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation. We'll have time to address your questions at various moments during the session. If at any time you experience technical issues with visual or audio, please also use the chat feature to bring it to our attention. It is now my pleasure to introduce Anna Teemer. Anna, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. We are on, you're here for APPA 1000, Total Cost of Ownership. This is a 5-part series, and you are on part 3. So if you've been with me for the previous 2 days, I certainly appreciate that. If you haven't been here, if this is your first time, just let me know in the chat box. That way I know where not to go as fast. What we're doing is we're giving you an overview of what is total cost of ownership and then how you can implement that at your organization. And so we're looking at how you can uh, know about the 13 principles, how you can make your organization more effective, different levels, basic, mid, and complex. And we're going to go through that today, how document management works, and then we're going to outline the next steps. And so ultimately, it's just what is total cost of ownership, and then how do you implement it? And so, again, you're on a 3-part series. Part 1, we looked at the overview of APPA and we went in depth for that. Second session was yesterday and we talked about the elements. Today, we're going to dive into the implementation. And I've got a lot of material to cover on the implementation side, so it is going to be over 2 sessions. One of the things I wanted to just mention for today's session is I'll be reviewing the implementation and going through all of the things that need to occur for that. And basically, what we're doing is we're building on elements that were presented to you in track 1 and or the first session and the second session. So Shannon, even though it's your first day here, you'll get caught up really quickly. And for those of you that have been here, we're really building upon those elements and then really diving in deep into those topics. Some of the slides will be word heavy, and I'll try to tell some funny joke at that time and break it up for you as we walk through some of the, I guess, requirements that are needed for implementation. And so during that time, what I'd ask you, and that'll be towards the last half of the slideshow, just really start asking me questions. It's really helpful for me as I'm talking for you to ask those questions during the presentation. So I'm happy to do that. All right, so getting our mind back around total cost of ownership. What is it? It's the summation of costs. That's easy. Everything from cradle to grave, our initial all the way to useful, end of useful life. Cost is what we determine with total cost of ownership. But as you know, it is much more than that. It is looking at all of the information and data to make a good decision. And liken that to this photo as we saw yesterday. We think this is a beautiful picture of some deer. And then as we look closer, it is actually a forest fire. Much like total cost of ownership, if we just zero in on one thing, that's all we see. So it's much better that we see the whole picture so we can make a better decision. All right, so how do we get started? So here's some first things to consider as we look at total cost of ownership. Yesterday, we talked about a little bit where do you start? So, total cost of ownership can be used with new buildings, new assets, or existing buildings and existing assets. And then also, there's the whole budgeting and finance portion of that as well. Another question you need to ask yourself is, do you want to just do one system or one building or one roof? Or do you want to apply this to your whole campus or maybe one campus out of many campuses? Um, and then another question, do you have access to actual costs? Are they estimated? Obviously, actual costs are best, but if you don't have access to that, that's okay. Estimated costs are also very, very, very good. And I'll show you how you can use that just to either showcase that to executive leadership or use that within your own environment to implement. Another key piece of information is, do you have access to the year installed or the age? And that can be approximate or it can be very actual. So um, just looking at some general numbers there if you don't have that actuals. And then the life cycle of that system or building, and then the replacement cost. So you'll notice the theme. This slide will come up and often during our presentation as we look through how do we implement this. All right, so these are our 13 principles. Um, and we've identified that there are the minimum requirements to implement total cost of ownership are implementing the six that are highlighted today. So yesterday we talked about integrity, asset information sharing. You just have to share information. That's the first part of this. And then foundation, what asset are you managing? Where are you going to store the data? Again, that can be back of napkin or wherever. And then adding those costs and inspection. And we'll talk a little bit about how much of an inspection you really need. And then that helps you to make some annual funding decisions. So that's a basic, I mean, all those 13 principles are awesome and great and needed for a complex implementation of total cost of ownership. There are actually only six that are needed for the bare bones minimum implementation. And so, what does that look like on our chart? So, you need to know what assets you're managing, one or many. Where are you going to store that? Back of a napkin or a complex CMMS system. And then the cost associated with those. That can be actual or it can be estimated, or it can be rule of thumb. We'll talk about that as well. Asset inspection, how much of that do you need? We'll talk through that. And then the financial reports. So adding in all of our other elements, including asset information sharing. You have to share the information to do the bare bones minimum. And now adding in the rest of what we talked about yesterday, those are all the other elements that could be included to make better decisions. So obviously, the more information, the more data you have, the better. That aligns with everything. Wish y'all could see this right now, but my dog is at my feet. And I typically like to walk around during a presentation. I'm trying to do that. And she's just like, nope, I want to be so close to you. So she's right here. Wish y'all could see her. She's cute. All right. So total cost of ownership, as we talked about, it can be scalable. It can be small to large, one or many, basic or complex. And what the other three areas, new assets, existing, or financials, that's what we're going to go into right now. So if we look at new assets and what's needed to implement total cost of ownership with our in the realm of a new asset, a new building, or new product, what's needed? Managed assets, okay? We're going to go back through this chart again. So managed assets, you need to know, are you just doing the building itself as a whole, or are you doing all the way down to the subcomponents of that new building? Where are you housing it? In this case, a large CMMS system is not needed for new building and doing a total cost of ownership exercise. You basically need a table. Excel would be great. You can do this on a piece of paper where you're drawing it, that you're housing this information. Costing. For new building and new construction, that is always for new building, it's always going to be predictive cost. So it's always costs that we don't know today. And depending on where you are with the new building, you may know, you may have the cost for feasibility, you may have the actual cost for design, but you don't have most of the costs, if not all of them, as you're moving through a total cost of ownership for new buildings. All of those are going to be forward looking. You're looking out the front of your car, not through the rear view. So these are just typically uh, forward looking costs. Asset inspection. Here's where, when you're looking at a new building, there's not an inspection that you're doing of that new building. You may not have it built yet. But what's needed from the asset inspection part of the principle for APPA TCO is that you need um, the system name, right? So we've got that with our managed asset. You need the cost, but here's what you need from the inspection, from the principles. It is the system age and its life cycle. So we know the age is 0 if it's brand new. If it's not brand new and if it's an existing building, that's different. But new building, it's 0. And then the life cycle of that. How long do we anticipate it lasting? So those are the two pieces of information you would need for the new construction. And then from that, you're able to generate, with the asset information sharing, of course, you're able to generate those financial reports. And essentially, for new construction or a new asset, you're basically creating a Excel document. It could be on a Word document as well, but Excel does summations for you. I like to use it. And you're listing the system and you're listing the initial costs, the maintenance and operations utility costs, the recapitalization costs, and then the end of life costs to then sum up what the total cost of ownership is. You might want to assign a value to the programmatic mission or vision. And we talked about that in our previous sessions, how it's not just cost, there could be good reason why that doesn't need to change. In addition to that, with the new construction or the new asset, you would have a alternate. So you'll see in this example, you've got a built-up roof versus a clay tile roof. With our initial cost, our M&O recap for both of those, and see if we can come up with the most efficient and best value for the university. Obviously, of course, including that programmatic emission and value included. You may have 3, you may have 4 options, depending on how many options you want to see with this total cost of ownership. But it's definitely including all of these costs as you're making those decisions. All right, any questions here so far in terms of the new construction, the new asset? We're going to actually talk through breakdown of the costs and how you might do this without going system by system. So ideally, you would want to use these systems for the new build, but if you don't have it, and we're going to walk through an easy way to do a new construction, new build, new asset. All right, so you have a new building, right? Here's our example of a building. Let's say that we have a building, it's 100, well, so any building, initial asset costs, first time costs typically run between 20 and 30% of the total cost of ownership. That's about in general. Could be much lower, could be much higher, but in general, that's about what it is. Operations and maintenance, the reoccurring cost is about 10 to 20%. And then our renewal and replacement costs are about 35 to 45%. And then our end of useful life is about 5 to 10%. And so 5 to 10% is probably a little high for end of useful life, but that's so far out in the future, 50 to 75 years. We wanted to be extra cautious when we looked at. All right, so let's take a 100,000 square foot building. And the anticipated life of this is 50 years, right? We typically have seen buildings that are supposed to last 75 plus. We're now building buildings that are supposed to only last 25 years. And so I kind of split the difference and just went to 50. And so if we look at that, our initial 45 million is our initial cost for that 100,000 square foot building. Um, and then if we look at our operations and maintenance costs, we've allocated about 30 million to that, 68 million for renewal and replacement, and then 5 million for our end of useful life. So for a total of 150 million. So how did we get these numbers? I gave you the percentages, but how do we actually get to these numbers? So that first 45 million, it is what it is, so to speak. It is what it is going to cost to build that new building. So 45 million, that's what we have. If we look at our operations and maintenance, you just take your dollar per square foot for your whole campus on average, and then multiply that by the square footage, and then that by the number of years, which is 50. So in this example, I use $6 a square foot. That's certainly not what we get at the University of Texas at Austin, but if I'm building a program and going to account for costs over the life of that 50 years, I'm going to put $6 a square foot in there, and that's all inclusive, landscaping, utilities, all of that inclusive. That's where we got the 30 million. So the 68 million, that's about 3 to 5% of the current replacement value. And so that's about 68 million over the life of that asset for that 50 years. Of course, that could be a little bit higher as time goes on, but that for the purposes of this, we're at about 68 million for the life of that. And then 5 million is just a percent of the total cost of ownership. So it's about 3 to 5%. And typically I use about a $5 million number and then adjust it based on whatever that percentage is for that building. You can back into that number with math. So 150 million, and that's how we got to those numbers. That is just a rule of thumb. So you're not having to track your individual systems in this way to get to what is the total cost of ownership for this building. So very simply and very quickly, you can now do this at your organization and develop that total cost of ownership. If we look at this just a little bit differently and say, okay, what is total cost of ownership? How do I relay that to people within my organization? 45 million is what it's costing us right now. And now you're telling me, Anna, that I have to go to my, VP, the CFO, and say, hey, guess what? We actually need 150 million for this building. And it's over 50 years of its life. And that just seems so far out there and such a high number. They may just push us aside and ignore us, right? So one other way that you can do this is say, okay, well, in a way to make this more real, because presidents typically have, a shorter life than most. CFOs may be there 5, 10, 15, 20 years, who knows? But let's assume, just to make this applicable to people, let's say, okay, well, what is the cost that are needed just in the next 5 years for this building only, right? So we're spending 45 million on this building initially. So for the next 5 years, what do I need for operations and maintenance added to my current budget? What do I need in terms of renewal and replacement for this building? So let's see. There are 3 million for operations and maintenance. We've got that value. That's just the $6 per square foot. And then we've got 7 million for renewal and replacement. And then the end of useful life, we don't have anything. So just over the next 5 years, we've got a $10 million um, addition on top of our 45 million. Now, in the next 5 years, not all of the 7 million for a renewal and replacement is going to be used, right? So typically the first things to go uh, for the for systems is finishes, right? And so those typically last about every 10 years or so. But that 7 million is our average across that 50 years. So we may not be spending that 7 million in year 1, 2, 3, and 4, or even the fifth year. But we do need to have that money sort of um, put aside so that we can use that money in the future. So that's fun. All right, so it's an additional 10 million or 22% of our construction cost. So yes, a good way to show some of that value there. All right, so boss, 68 million, 3 to 5% of CRV. The way that I did that, and help me if I've got my calculation wrong, because I could. Let me just go back to that. I want to make sure. So 68 million, if we're doing our math, so 3 to 5% of 45 million. So I did 45 million, 5% of that, and then multiplied that by the 50 years. So that's what we would need over the life of that. So check me on that math and see if that's right. And then Chris, 3% of 45 million times 50 years, you were on a different number. Sorry. Yes, I think, Chris, you're exactly right. That's what I calculated it. But if that's wrong, please let me know. I want to make sure these numbers make sense to you all. All right. So if we're looking again at new construction or basic, mid, and complex, implementing total cost of ownership for our new building. Oops, and there's my first error on my slides. Existing building asset is actually not the existing building, it's the new building asset. So the basic is to use that rule of thumb. Use our percent of CRV, use the aggregate MO&E across your organization, use what you want to be getting. In my case, I use the $6. That's what I want to get. And then there's no life cycle dates that are used. We're not using any systems, so we're not having to calculate or use any dates. This is basically just a rule of thumb estimate total cost of ownership. And that's the example that we went over. For mid, you're using both rule of thumb, but you're also using historical costs when you can, in areas that you can. So maybe that's in your maintenance and operations, or maybe that's in your recapitalization. You're using more historical costs on that than anything. And maybe you're still using rule of thumb for one or two of those. And in that case, as you are using historical costs, you might be using actual life cycle dates and systems for that. And we're also including the mission value, and because it's not just about cost, right? So, what is our best component or system that we might use in here, accounting for what's the best for our maintenance? Do we have to train them on this? Do we only have 10 colors that we're using for wall colors at the university? So that's where that mission value comes in. And then complex is using historical costs by building type or system, and then we're adding in multipliers if needed for more complex systems. We're using actual life cycle dates, and then we're also using our mission value. And so it's basically what we talked about from basic all the way to complex. So that is for our new building. Let me ask you, what does MO&E stand for? That's maintenance, operations, and equipment. And so basically that is our preventive maintenance. It can also be work order management or trouble calls. So Maintenance is like changing out filters, things like that. All right, so if we're looking at existing assets and how we can apply this to our existing assets. So we have our assets, so they're in our portfolio today, and they might be halfway through their life. And we do need that asset inventory. Costs. Okay, here's where our costs are not just projections. Now they're a mix of both what we projected, because there's still stuff to happen, plus what actually happened. So it's almost like we have two different numbers playing into this cost. So actuals and then our predicted. Asset inspection, same as before with our new construction. We don't, for basic implementation, we just need to know the asset name, the asset cost, which we have, both our actuals plus our predictive. And then the asset inspection, it's not really an inspection, but the principle of it is we just need how old is that system and then how long is it supposed to last. Obviously, if you have an existing asset and you were able to add in more of the, you know, the condition of that system, how is it performing, all of those things, right on. That gets us to our complex or our existing assets. But in this case, we just need those four pieces of information. Same concept, we'll get asset sharing and get to our financial reports. And obviously, if we had everything else, it would be great. And so, like we talked yesterday, if we have an asset and it's lasting 20 years, oh, Caitlin, I'm going to stop here. You asked, could you talk a bit more about mission value? I missed that last time. Yes, let me this is, you're actually setting me up perfectly for this right here. So if we have this life of an asset and it's 20 years old, we have our first cost plus our reoccurring costs. And this is what has actually happened. We can still use estimates on that, but ideally we want to use actuals. And then the life of the asset, we have future costs. So it's those are estimates based on estimates or actuals as well. So we've got our past plus our future cost to get to our existing asset. And so yesterday we talked about this roof example and should we replace it? Should we repair it? Or should we do nothing? And we came up with these costs. And so the 36,500, that is the cheapest cost for us to do today. And if we didn't have a robust definition of total cost of ownership, you would leave here going, I just need to drive my organization to the lowest cost possible. And if you take nothing else from this presentation, total cost of ownership is so much more than that. And the reason is, Caitlin, it's about that mission value. So that 36,500, you have to take into account the mission of the university. You have to take into account the budget, variables, the politics, all the fun things that can't be easily added into a formula for total cost of ownership. So we talked about yesterday that 20,000 to replace it today. We may not have that money today to replace it, right? We may not have them. And so that 36,500, even though it's the cheapest, we may not be able to do it. Second thing to remember is we may not know that the building is going to get demoed. So we have to add in that mission value, which is we have information that that building's going to get demoed. So we're not going to spend 20,000 on that roof. And then conversely, it could be back to the mission. Is it a roof over my building where I'm residing, or is it a roof over the president's office? And so that also aligns with the mission, which can't be calculated in a simple summation of the cost. And so, Caitlin, that's what I mean by that mission value and adding that in. I hope I've answered your question. So if we look at that existing asset, we're looking at our past costs plus our future costs to look at the five decision making pieces. Um, and then if we look at our basic, mid, and complex, our basic is for our existing assets. We can also use aggregate costs here for our organization and divide that by a square foot and get um, what our total cost of ownership is, even for our actual costs that have happened and for our future costs. So basic is it's just an estimate. For existing building and asset, my slide is right in terms of the title there. We're using an estimated life cycle. In mid, we're using aggregate and actuals. We're still using estimated life cycle dates, and we're adding in that mission value. And then in complex, where we have actuals, we're going to use the actuals, and where we have accurate estimates based on actuals for our future costs, we're going to use them for that existing asset. Then we're going to use the actual dates. When does that system need to be replaced? When does it not? And then we're also going to use mission value. So that's where we have our basic, mid, and complex for our existing asset. And then looking at our financials to build upon where we were yesterday, kind of the same thing. We take these 6 key pieces of information and we're able to generate our financial reporting. And so from yesterday, we talked about, and I've been driving home this whole time, 4 pieces of information to generate reports. And one of them is the system name. So you're able to map out and put that into an Excel, a table, and then also translate that into a graph when we need that funding. So very, very simple in terms of doing some predictive analysis for your organization. And then I always like to add in this uh, picture that I showed y'all yesterday. Everything in red is over 40 years, and then everything else that's colored is past its useful life for HVAC. So pretty easy how we built upon yesterday. And looking at our basic, mid, and complex, it's the same concept here with our financial reporting. We're using aggregate, and then we're using actual, and then more accurate costs for our complex when we look at our financial reports. Okay, so we've gone through what this looks like. And I'm going to take a pause here and do a little commercial break and allow you to have some questions, but also just a little bit of a reprieve, maybe something funny here. All right, so why do we do total cost of ownership? We are asked to do so much with so little. And so there are some other alternatives. We could have a brand new university that's sitting right next to um, uh, our exact campus, and it's sitting right there waiting for us to move into, which never happens. Um, or we could wait for the building to burn down. So there's another radical approach. And I actually found this video. It's a building that's on fire and burning and flooding at the same time. So I don't know about you, but there's a few buildings on campus that if everybody was out and everybody was safe, I'd love for that to I apologize for the quality of that. It is from a Facebook feed. I just thought it was priceless. There's our little commercial break. All right, so we talked about our minimal requirements and what that looks like in terms of doing a total cost ownership implementation. And so now we're going to really dive into as far as we can get, and then we'll continue this in our 4th series, but our 2nd series of the implementation. We're going to dive into each of these and talk about some of the questions and talk about the things that are needed within those principles and how you can take this back to your organization. All right. So we always begin with the end in mind first. And so I'm going to start with decision making, which again, if you remember, that's right up at the top. And so what we want to look at is what are the decisions that you want to make with total cost of ownership? And it goes back to those questions. Do you want to have a new building? Do you want to talk about an existing? Do you want to have financial reporting? Do you want to put together? What is it that you want to do? So that part of that decision making and those questions that you have. So here's the principles within the decision making. So we've got asset decision, we've got our annual funding, and then we've got our comprehensive plan. Okay. So we've also outlined what you can do pre TCO, what a basic implementation is, what a mid, and a complex. And we've done this for each of the principles that we have outlined. In addition to that, on this better sheet that's not visible in PowerPoint very easily, so I didn't include it here, it also has the shall statements and a definition of what that implementation looks like. And with Billy's help, I will get all of this to you, some handouts to you after this presentation to make sure that that's all included. Because typically, if we were sitting together in a room, we would walk through this, and you would be circling where you are with each of these principles, and then that would then give you a roadmap to show where you may be far along in one of the areas of total cost of ownership. So then that gives you a roadmap to say we really need to focus on this decision making that's happening right here, um, and we need to ramp that up. So I hate to read through each of these, and so I won't bore you with doing that. But we'll just take an example. So the asset annual funding, remember that's the one that is part of that basic six principles that need to be implemented. So I've highlighted that one. And basically, it is generating that long-term budget for the asset, identifying annual costs. And we talked about how to do that with some of our data, whether that's um, estimates or aggregate, and then all the way to our complex implementation, where those new asset costs are projected near and long term, and they're updated annually using an automated system um, or semi-automated system, because nothing is totally automated, right? Right. So this really outlines what you need to do, just like first, what's our pre-work, and then where you are basic, mid, and complex. And so I'll ask the question, where do most of you think that you are on the asset annual funding? Do you think you're basic, mid, or complex? Go ahead and put that in the chat because I don't think I can hear anybody. Boz, you're at mid. Great. So your major new equipment asset costs are projected near and long term and updated annually. Great. Boz, where do y'all house that information? Is that on a simple Excel? Is that in a database? Do y'all have something designed for that? As well. Various systems. Okay, great. Yeah. And remember, we talked about yesterday, and we'll talk more about this as we're doing implementation. Not everything has to be housed in the same system. There's technologies and tools today, APIs and ways to merge data, Tableau and visualizations that brings in data from sources and joins it and serves it up for you. So it doesn't always have to be in the same system. All right, so let's talk through some of the decision-making questions that you should be asking your organization. So, General questions. Are decisions being made on TCO information? If not, why? What needs to be in place to make these total cost of ownership decisions? How can we help to make those asset decisions for our staff? And if we jump down to that asset decision, does everyone have that information? All the way executive leadership to staff. And if not, what are the obstacles? Some cases we may not ever be able to totally get rid of that. We talked about, sometimes the politics of knowing that something is being built, or something that's being um, given over to somebody else. We can't know about that as those decisions are being made. But when can we help to help our staff who are frontline working on that piece of equipment to say, we probably don't want to replace that. We probably just want to patch it. And maybe there's a group of buildings that we identified that kind of sit within that bubble until a decision is made. Maybe we don't know what the decision is, but maybe we populate a list that these are definitely do not touch, do not do. Here's a list of buildings that we may or may not. We might want to check in with upper leadership. We're not really sure if things are going to happen or not within these buildings. And then these are buildings that definitely replace, do what you need to do to get it working because we're not doing anything to that building. So, other questions are on here. You're predicting modeling. Are you forecasting? And for how many years? Deciding on that. Is it 5? Is it 10, 15, 20, 25, depending on the audience or not? And then what major obstacles are prohibiting you from forecasting or doing predictive modeling today? So I do want to ask that in the chat. What major obstacles are prohibiting you from forecasting or doing that predictive modeling today? I've shared with you there's 4 pieces of information that you need. And I want to just ask, like, does that seem feasible? Or there's some other major obstacles that are prohibiting you from doing that? Even if it's that basic level that, hey, I'm just going to do some estimates. Is there anything that's prohibiting you from doing that forecasting or model? Lack of data in our CMMS, replacement cost life cycle, right? Data, yeah, it's always about data, right? Hopefully, though, with some of these examples I've given you, there's some rule of thumb that you can do, right? General rule of thumb, and you can use that to your advantage in some cases to do some of that predictive modeling. Um, and maybe it's start with something simple. I always start with roofs. That's something people can see and do, and it's easily executable. Roofs are. You don't have to shut down a building to do that. You just need to find some lay down space. All right. So great questions for our TCO decision making there. If we're looking next at integrity, which is our lowest level of our triangle, and which everything is foundational, which I believe this is foundational to the success of total cost of ownership. It's largely driven by our culture, and we're also looking at how everyone is working with that common data. Okay. All right, so here are the principles for integrity. So we've got our information sharing, and again, that one's highlighted in yellow because that one I think is at minimum. That's our basic implementation of total cost of ownership, right? So how do we make common data accessible throughout the organization? And so basic is having information and available to decision makers. And then complex is all that information is collected one time and managed centrally in a GIS and BIM respectively. So we jumped very quickly from, hey, we've got information and data available to complex, we're in a GIS and BIM environment, which by the way, UT Austin is not yet in a total GIS or BIM environment. You're just now starting to do them. So you're in good company if you don't have that. But it certainly is a goal that we want to have. EMIS, Boz, what does that mean? EMIS 2. That must be another type of system or environment respective to GIS and BIM, I assume. And when you say it, I might go, energy management information. Yes, excellent. Yep, great. Wonderful. All right, so we also have asset reporting and our complex level on that. Obviously, it's just generating those reports, but our complex level of that is having an automated dashboard where we get triggers about systems that are maybe not operating the way that we would like. So it's almost like a trigger or an exception report where that system is it's spending a lot more money than we anticipated. Okay, that would be a great way to then, of course, go back to our asset decision. All of these principles are interrelated. That would help us go back to our previous decision making, our asset decision. And wouldn't that be great for that information to then be shared with decision makers to then travel back to our staff and our technicians to say, hey, something's wrong with this system. I know you've got PMs on this week, but we're actually not going to do it. I'm going to send somebody out to go investigate what's going on with it. And that comes off of the list to go do some PM work on. Right? So there we go. Or we have someone going out there to do some retro commissioning, that kind of thing. So that would be super. Data management and verification, this is really just making sure that accurate information is used in all areas. And so the basic of that is begin a process to manage and verify information. Just start with something. There's so many data points, so many pieces of information. Just start implementing, hey, I want the contractor to submit as-built in this way so that when we receive them, they go directly to being stored and tagged in the manner that we want them to be. Versus, we may not have a way that we want to receive these from the contractor. And thus, now we get them in so many different ways. And it's hard for us later to come back and manage that information and data, right? Same thing as we add new equipment into our system. We don't have a Kobe environment. We have a Excel document that we have folks upload. The contractor uploads, and then that gets pushed into our CMMS system, Famous. So we're still in the mid coming out of the caveman era with our process, but it's something, right? It's something. We've created something that will allow for that information and data to be transferred as accurately as possible. So just start with something. I know that elephant's big, but definitely something to do. One of the big things I think that this integrity piece really speaks to is this is culture. This is about how the culture in your organization looks to do something that may not benefit them today, but benefits somebody else in the future. So, as an example, a PM may be building new or renovating new, and they just want to get through that project as fast as possible. What's important is that there's a culture of I need to make sure that this information is available and accessible and accurate for the technicians or for the next PM that may come and do a renovation in 5 years, right? So it's a culture of how do we share information and do not just what I need to do to finish this project, but a culture of how do I help um, all those within the organization. And in a place as big as UT, we've got those silos, and we talked about those in our last couple of sessions. How, it's super important that we maintain those silos, but instead of having those walls, that they're invisible and there's this change of information between those two. That's super important in in these three principles for integrity, making sure that we've got these silos of excellence. So there's project related data, there's asset related data, and then there's metadata, which is data about the data. And so um, when we have common data elements within each of those, it allows for the improved data verification and confidence later when we're sharing that data. That's what happens. So when we have an asset and we've identified, hey, this is an asset in this building, when a project comes along, it's impacting or replacing that system, it's saying, hey, I'm tagging to that system and here are all my project documentation for that asset, and then you're adding in metadata, which is data about the data, who verified it, when did they verify it, when was it last entered, that's metadata. Then now you have all these data elements and you're sharing them across the organization. So at UT, but don't tell anyone because it's really not at UT. um, we when we do projects, we have our equipment list, and the maintenance group uses that equipment list to do work orders off of. When a project comes along and that project related data, we don't tie that equipment, no equipment, not even the roof, to that project in our system. And it's the same system, it's still in Famous. But for whatever reason, we have not gotten into good practice of tying that asset to that project. So what ends up happening is the only way that that asset gets updated is at the end of the project. We have to make sure that that add delete log is updated and uploaded into Famous to now give that to our maintenance. Okay. What things are missing? What huge things are missing if those aren't joined? We eventually get it joined, but what is missing? And if y'all were in the room, I'm sure y'all be shouting it out. I'll wait just a second. But one of the things that's missing without having that join is we don't have an asset decision that's transferred to our technician and staff. So they're going to keep doing work orders and maintenance and trouble calls and PM work on that system that we're replacing. So they may have their list of things to do for that day, and they walk up into the space and they go, oh, this is getting replaced. Now we've wasted time and efficiency. And it's a small waste of time and efficiency. They'll go to their next one. But we've lost that efficiency and that asset decision getting to our technicians as we've not done that. So that is a big issue with these data elements and making sure that they're joined. I do want to take a quick moment to kind of talk about the data elements since we're talking about that and sharing that information and data. APPA does have a data element database, and you can go onto the APPA website and you can, in that search bar, you can put data element database, and you're able to search for all the data elements there for you. We've tried to put in all of the APPA TCO data elements into that and align with that. and make sure that we're all using the same common core definition. So if you haven't taken a look at that, that's super great. And Billy, who's on the call and introduced me today, she actually had a huge hand in making that happen. So we'll give her a really great big hand because that was not easy to do. Lots of data and lots of information. So, okay, so finishing up TCO integrity. Um, Here are the questions that you need to be asking your organization in order to implement this. So I've broken it down into sharing, trusting the data, culture, and then the value of TCO to data to collection. And so that value of TCO to data to collection, I'm going to jump to that one first, just because it's quite important, right? Do you need metadata? Do you need all these tagging capabilities? So at UT, not at UT, remember, bad things don't happen at, at your respective organization. So I'm talking about another organization. At UT, we actually have um, Meridian, which houses our documents. And we set that up with the help of someone, I don't know, maybe 8 or so years ago. And at that time, we had so many tags and categories of how we would store that data or that document into Meridian, right? Because total cost of ownership is not just about the cost, it's about all this other data that's important. So we housed these documents in Meridian with all of these tags. Well, as you go to search a document, we thought having more tags and more ways to find that document would be beneficial. Of course, that didn't pan out the way that we wanted. And we have tags and categories that we don't even use, but more importantly, they confuse people in the search fields. So it becomes very cumbersome for our staff to find documents. They're like, well, should I be looking for it under this category or this category? And there's so many categories to choose from. So therein lies, I think, a good example of how the value of implementing um, uh, tags and data elements and how we're going to share this information. We took it a step too far. And so now we're going back into Meridian and condensing it down into a truncated version of those, maybe like 7 or so tags, right? So we're not using as many uh, tags and confusing people on how to search for things. So that's a good example of the value of what we did was never brought to fruition with what we thought. So you can learn from us, that would be great. Um, Also, there's ways, as you know, we're all working remotely. How do we do a lot of this as much electronically and with that one touch rule as possible? And I'm going to bring you back to that shoe example for my kids. How it's 4 touches before it goes to the right place. Same thing with the document or piece of information. We want that information to come in one time accurately in the right spot. Ideally, you would want your contractor to do that. So here's a concept that my mind was blown when I heard this being talked about. So we are in the process of replacing Famous either with some other system. And I called one of my old bosses, and he's at University of Arkansas, and he does about the same amount of work that we do. I don't know if the number of projects is the same, but about the same dollar value of work. And he said, they don't have a system. They don't have this. They don't have that. And I said, gosh, how are y'all managing it? And you say that you have like 9 or 10 project managers. We have like 40 here at UT. How are y'all doing that? And his response was, we have the contractor and the PSP, the people who we hire, they come in and they provide and they input our schedule values where we want them to be set up. And he said his ideal world would be this one touch rule, and he articulated it great. It would be the contractor. Think about schedule values as the contractor goes through construction. They input that directly into the system, and this is his ideal. They don't do that today. They input that directly into the system as the schedule values. They are the ones who know it. They are the ones who provide it. Why wouldn't they be the ones to input it into our system, right? Why wouldn't, if we're paying them, we give them the means, an Amazon like application that says, here's where you place the values and have them put that in there. There needs to be some oversight, sure, and someone for them to call, sure, yes. But that one touch rule of having that information being put directly into that system would be super, right? Super, super. All right. So I'm not going to read through all of these questions that you might want to ask your organization. But, looking at the business processes, what reports are you sharing? What information isn't being shared? We call this getting this the right information to the right person at the right time. And with TCO integrity, it's getting the right information at the right time and making sure that it's right, is another way to say that for this TCO integrity. All right. So we've gone through two sort of categories: our decision making, which is our top one, our end in mind, and then we've also looked at our foundation, which is our integrity. We have two more to go through, and we're going to go through those in session 4. So I'm going to stop right now and have you open up and just give me some, obstacles that maybe you're having with either decision making or with your TCO integrity, those principles. I'm actually going to go back to um, the slide where you can see all the principles, so it's easy for us to kind of conceptualize this. Here we go. So we've talked about decision making, those 3 principles, integrity, those 3 principles, only because I like to start with the end in mind. Where are we starting from? What decision making do we want to make with total cost of ownership? And then what do we need to prep our organization with in terms of integrity, and getting that data sharing and accuracy up to the highest level. So, what are some of the obstacles you're seeing within decision making or integrity? Um, what are some of those? And then I'll also ask. I want to leave question or time for questions. So, what are some of the other questions that you have about anything I've shared? Do you want to go back over something? I can't see if some of you are totally confused, totally bored, or totally excited about this. So pop in some questions or some comments. I do want to leave some time to go over some things that I might have spoken too fast about. CMMS, the maintenance management system. If you don't know what that means, ask that question. So I'm going to open it up right now. We can have some of those. Nothing yet. Here we go. Yesterday, did you mention a 10% discount code for ordering the TCO parts online? Yes, I sure did. Um, Let me see here. I'm going to go to that slide and pop that up for you. Hmm. Almost there. Here we go. All right, so there is the code for part 1. If you just want to purchase that one, because there's 2 parts, that's just giving you an overview of total cost of ownership. And then part 2 really dives into the implementation of that and gives you more detail. So there's the code for that one. And then if you want both, there's the code for that as well. Great. I'm trying to leave a lot of time for you to ask questions either during or after. Um, I want to ask, did the let me ask this question then. Oh, Billy, thank you. That discount is valid through November 30th. So you've got about roughly 15 days, a little bit less than that to do that, to purchase. One of the things I wanted to ask you, since I still have you and there aren't a whole lot of questions, did the application of rule of thumb make sense to you as as you look to apply that to your organization for new construction, new assets, new buildings, or existing assets and buildings? Did that example, did those basic level um, examples make sense? I feel like you can do it. Because one of the things that I think can be daunting about something like total cost of ownership, and if there's another thing to take away from this presentation, is that um, total cost of ownership doesn't require a whole lot of change to what you're already doing. We are all doing amazing, great, wonderful work. We have our best intents, and if you're on this call, then you definitely want to do better for your organization. You're trying to learn how to do that. And so, what total cost ownership does is it adds to it or provides a framework of how you can um, market this or sell this or tweak some of your current processes. Um, some of this is things you already know, right? Common sense. We need to share data across the organization. How do we do that? What in what ways, and how can we share that across? I'm hopeful that this helps you to see that it can be done, and or a framework for how to do this within your organization and to sell it to your organization to then create some of that predictive modeling that you can do. No more questions, but so I'll talk a little bit, and I got into this yesterday. I'll talk a little bit about the capital renewal. And so at UT, we went from 14 million, 18 million, 22 million, and then now we're at 41 million for capital renewal. And so at our organization, implementing total cost of ownership has been difficult with our new construction. So using that rule of thumb, I'll be honest, works for just a minute. But no one wants to hear, hey, this $45 million building is actually going to cost us 150 million. So it doesn't go over very well. And quite frankly, I don't have the same influence in that arena with those folks as I do with the existing buildings. So we started with the existing buildings. And what we do is we do a fantastic job of implementing this um, at the existing building level. So we have our managed assets, we have our asset inventory. It's housed though in two separate places. It's not just in one place. So we have our famous data where the um, maintenance and the other information is housed. But we also have a condition assessment database where that asset inspection is done. And then we're starting commissioning reports, and those are housed in Meridian. And so what we've had to do is, even though they're in desperate locations, if we had them all aligned with a unique identifier in that asset inventory, wherever it lies, we could join them very easily together. What happened though is we have not joined them together in that same asset code. And even our asset classification, right below grayed out managed assets, we don't use the same classification in each of those systems either. So I can't join it on that either. So sometimes I'm joining them by key codes. And it takes, or by, yeah, key codes like HVAC, AHU, um, the AC unit. So I'm going in and saying, if it has any of these things in the title, I want to join it with this one over here. So it's a very manual process, but we've been able to collect that information and data into a predictive analysis of how much money we need, which is how we've garnered that additional funding. So, Boz, I think it was Boz that you talked about the energy management information um, systems. That's where that asset performance comes in, the energy and sustainability. So we couple um, our energy EUI, our asset performance, what is it costing us in maintenance? If it's higher cost, it gets a higher score. How is it? What's the condition of it? We have 10 old buildings, 10 old HVAC systems. Which ones do we do first? Our external assessment helps us to figure that out. And then we populate that onto graphs and depict that for our organization. And so for our existing assets that we have, we've really developed um, a good total cost of ownership example, but primarily using that asset inspection and then manually joining that data across the organization. And quite frankly, it's an 80-20 rule. Because I'm manually joining and because I'm picking out these words to join these pieces of information together, quite frankly, it's not perfect and it's not completely accurate. So I would say that, again, it doesn't have to be totally accurate. And that 80-20 rule, 80% accurate, I think is okay. And in some cases, I'll be honest, it might even be 70-30 in our case. But we've been able to use that UT for our existing assets. So, okay, I don't see any more questions. I'm going to go back to my slide that gives you the discount. And with that, we hope to see you in part 4 and part 5. We'll give Billy, I'm sure we'll be giving information to folks on how they can join us for the 4th session and the 5th session. And there's no additional cost if you're here today. It's just an extension of the conference because it is a 5-part series and we did one a day. We'll do the last 2 at another time. So if there aren't any more questions, Billy, anything to share or to wrap us up?
Yes, I'd just like to thank Anna for taking time out of her busy schedule to put this all together. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees for attending today. And by taking time out of your extremely busy schedules, I know campuses are very busy at this time. And I would like to wish everybody a happy holiday season. Be safe, stay healthy. Until next time, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye now.
Bye. Thank you.